I'm also going to ask people, if you wish to ask questions, use the raise hand feature rather than just talk out. That way we can keep it a little more orderly and get more questions in that way.
All right, without further ado, take it away, Lee.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. So you would ask if I'm going to touch on the topic of my book. In fact, the title of my talk tonight is How to Talk to a Science Denier. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of a mini version of some of the things that I talk about. And just before I start, I wanted to say that I've got two very large sleepy dogs here. So if you hear a big sigh in the middle of my talk, it's just their commentary because they've heard the talk before. All right. So I wanted to talk to you tonight about how to defend science from science deniers by giving scientists and science communicators some better tools to push back. And you might think, well, what could be better to push back against science deniers than the evidence? But the problem is that you don't convince somebody who doesn't hold beliefs based on good evidence by giving them more evidence. That's called the information deficit model, and it simply doesn't work. If you've ever talked to a science denier and you share facts, those just have a way of not actually convincing them. And so don't mistake and think you're just talking to one of your scientific colleagues. You tell them the facts and they change their mind. It's a wonderful thing. That does not work with science deniers. So we need a little bit more strategic approach, and I'm going to start with what the research in the field tells us. Threshold issues, some people in thinking about this are concerned about something called the backfire effect, which was a result of research by Brendan Nine and Jason Riefler in 2010. And what they found in their study is that they were concerned with people who heard false information and then heard correcting information and whether they would change their mind. And what they found is that when you did this experiment with partisans, they tended not to want to change their mind. And what they found is when you did the experiment with hyperpartisans, on some occasions, they not only didn't change their mind, but they held their original beliefs even more strongly, which is what they deemed the backfire effect, because it's a perverse effect, isn't it? I mean, you could almost sort of see how they wouldn't change their mind because they think, well, the evidence doesn't apply here. But to think that the evidence applies in the reverse of what it's intended, so that it caused them to double down on their original belief, that's a perverse effect. And the problem is that if that were true, it would mean that you could actually make it worse by trying to talk to a science denier, because by presenting them with facts, you could be causing them to double down and hold their mistaken views more strongly. Well, the good news is that recent studies have shown that that part of the original finding, the backfire part of it, not the I don't change my mind part of it, but the backfire part of it could not be replicated. Porter and Wood and some other folks have found that that finding was not reproducible. Even Nine and Riefler now admit that maybe it was a unicorn, you know, it showed it, they didn't make it up, it wasn't fraud, but it just is not reproducible. That is incredibly good news, because what that means is that the worry that we just had about, does that mean that talking to people might make it worse? No, it's not. You can go back and read all these articles in the New Yorker, and I think there was one in the Atlantic about whether facts change people's minds, and everybody was, you know, really worried about it at the time, but it turns out that it's not a real thing, so we're not causing harm. And in fact, the worst that would happen is that somebody would just stay dug in on their beliefs. So you tried and failed, but they're not going to hold their beliefs any more strongly. As one commentator in the debate put it, we're fact resistant, but we're not fact immune. Okay. All right, and I talk about some of this a little bit more in the book. There was a brilliant study that came out in the summer of 2019 by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid in the journal Nature Human Behavior, which provided the first empirical evidence to show that you could actually cause science deniers to give up their mistaken beliefs. So they measured this in the lab and found a statistically significant effect. It doesn't always work, but it works often enough that they can recommend it. Let me describe the study. There were 1,700 subjects, probably 18-year-olds, students between 18 and 21. Some of them were in Germany, some of them were in the United States. And what they did is that this study was done online, and they exposed them to scientific misinformation, and then immediately pushed back. That is, they immediately debunked the information that they had just heard, kind of similar to the Nine and Riefler study in a way. But what they found is that if you did the work immediately, that is, you presented them with the misinformation and then you immediately pushed back, as I said, that in a statistically significant number of cases, you could cause them to give up their mistaken beliefs. There were two ways of doing this. The first is something called content rebuttal. This is no surprise. If somebody who holds mistaken beliefs about climate change, and you're a climatologist, go nuts, right? You know the specifics. You know when they say, oh, but I thought that the temperature hadn't gone up in such and such, number of years. Well, you know that that's not true, and you know exactly how to push back. So if you're a content specialist, then content rebuttal is one way that you can push back, which is very cheering, right? It means that facts can, in some cases, work. The second, the more intriguing to me way of pushing back is something called technique rebuttal. And the reason I found this intriguing is because you don't have to be a scientist to do it, okay? The technique rebuttal was based on an earlier finding by the Hufnagel brothers and by John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski and others who have developed this idea that all science deniers reason in the same way. So here we're not talking about the content of their beliefs, we're talking about why they believe it. What reasoning process led them to hold their mistaken beliefs? And if you understand the toxic form of reasoning that science deniers use, you can use that to push back against them, not even entering into the content of their beliefs. Well, I'm not going to keep in suspense. I'll tell you the blueprint that all science deniers follow. Flat earthers, climate deniers, COVID deniers, anti-vaxxers, evolution deniers, they all do the same 5 things. Number 1, they cherry pick evidence. Number 2, they believe in conspiracy theories. Number 3, they rely on fake experts and they denigrate real experts. Number 4, they engage in illogical reasoning. And number 5, they insist that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. And you're just thinking back over all the anti-vax and other things that you've heard recently, that you can kind of see this, right? People who discover this, yeah, they got the right 5 things. And what technique rebuttal allows you to do is that if you understand those 5 tropes of flawed science denial reasoning, you can use those to debunk the beliefs that people have. So say you expose them to misinformation based on a conspiracy theory, then you can say, do you realize that that's based on a conspiracy theory? Let me show you why that's a bad thing. Interesting, there was a parallel study, a commentary in the same issue on something called pre-bunking, not debunking, but pre-bunking, where it's maybe even more effective if you warn them in advance of hearing the misinformation. And that's interesting to me. I've got a friend named Andy Norman who just wrote a book called Mental Immunity, who talks about inoculating ourselves against bad ideas based on some of this research. Bache and Schmid found that both forms of rebuttal, content rebuttal and technique rebuttal, work equally well, and that there's no additive effect. And that too is good news, because it means that anybody can do this and you're not leaving anything on the table, right? If technique rebuttal and content rebuttal both work equally well and there's no additive effect, then just pick your poison. Use the one that you feel most comfortable with. If you're a climatologist talking about climate, go ahead. If you're a climatologist talking about anti-vax, you can use technique rebuttal. It's the same. So we all should grab an oar. We all have a role to play in pushing back against science denial. Now, let me talk a little bit about some bad news from the study. Not a flaw, but just a finding, which is that they showed that you can only mitigate, not overturn, the effect of exposure to scientific misinformation. That's bad news, right? Because it means that for some people, once they hear misinformation, it takes hold, right? In social psychology, they know this, right? The very first person to speak is the person who wins, because that, maybe it's called the primacy effect, right? The first thing that you hear is the thing that you believe, even if it's wrong, even if it's immediately retracted, it still sits there. Right? This is why a car dealership will always, start at the top, and they'll anchor that price to the first thing that you hear, because the first thing that you hear can be very compelling. So that's a bad news, because even though some people can be talked out of these beliefs, some people cannot. So what it means is that the best thing is not to allow people to be exposed to scientific misinformation in the first place. Bache and Schmid joke that if you're invited to a debate with a science denier, you should agree to go and then cancel at the last minute if it means the debate will be canceled, because then no misinformation will be spread, right? But if the debate's going to go on anyway, then you have to show up, because the worst thing is for the liar to have the microphone and to be unrebutted. Okay, that's by far the worst thing they found in their study. And if you read the study, they give some scripts. It's really a well done, interesting, readable study. So the point of talking to a science denier isn't just to debunk false information once it's out there. It's to keep them from hearing misinformation in the first place. Okay, it's to get the truth out there as a kind of a prophylactic, if you possibly can. And once I read this study, I joked with my friends that I'd been studying this so long. This was the first empirical evidence. I joke with my friends that I could have read this study if my hair were on fire, right? I loved this study. But as someone who had studied science denial for 10, 15 years before this, I had some questions. I had some concerns. And here are a couple of my concerns. First, I worried about time proximity. Because remember that Bache and Schmid were overturning the misinformation the minute after the person had heard it. But that's not in the real world how it usually happens. What usually happens is somebody hears misinformation and it festers. And then then they hear it again, and then they discuss it with their friends who agree with them, and then they hear it again. So you can get into situations in the real world where someone has been marinating in disinformation for a decade. Does technique rebuttal work with them? Does content rebuttal work with them? I don't know. That hasn't been tested, but that was one question. In fact, that raises a good point. Is that why content rebuttal worked in the Bache and Schmid study, but it didn't work in the Nyan and Riefler study, the backfire effect study? Because maybe they were bringing in people who were partisans, who had already been marinating in this disinformation for a long period of time. So that's a concern. The second concern that I had is that this study was done online. Now, I know why they do studies online. Of course, it's part of how studies are done these days. But it raised in my mind the question of whether content rebuttal and technique rebuttal might work, and in fact even work better, face-to-face. Okay, so because if you think about it, the worst possible way to convince somebody is in the comment section of an article on the Washington Post, right? So isn't it much better to talk to somebody face to face? So this is a question they had. Maybe these results work, but they're better face to face. So I think there are answers to these questions, but they are not in the empirical literature. To my knowledge, no one has studied this. And here, since we outrun the scientific literature, I want to turn to the anecdotal literature, which is, frowned upon. But in this case, we don't have any place else to look. And I think that the anecdotal literature provides us some mechanism for in fact, designing some studies so that we could do more empirical studies to figure out, maybe to answer these two questions about hardcore deniers and face-to-face. Do these technique and content rebuttal work better? Here's what I found in the anecdotal literature. So I became a fiend for reading every single story that I possibly could of an anti-vaxxer or a climate denier or anybody else who had changed their mind on their science denial beliefs, because I wanted to know how that had happened. You know, what happened, because in some cases, these were very hardcore believers. And what I've learned in reading the anecdotal literature was this: virtually everyone who had their minds changed on a science denial topic had it done after a face-to-face encounter with someone that they trusted. Someone who took the time to engage with them. So I have a thick file of these, and I've discussed many of these in the book. Again, it's not a scientific study. This is an anecdotal look, but they all look so similar, all of these cases, that it really got my attention. And it led me to some conclusions. I think that engagement is key for overcoming somebody's science denial beliefs, because science denial is not just about facts. People don't hold their denialist beliefs based on evidence or facts. How could they? So why do they hold them? They hold them based on values, on identity, on the disinformation that they're hearing resonating with something that they already wanted to believe, okay? So, and if you think about the role of disinformation is intentionally created by somebody. Science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. Somebody is out there lying about the vaccines for COVID, right? They're inventing this to mislead people. And the point of the lie is not just to get you to doubt some specific scientific fact. It's to get you to distrust the people who are telling the truth. And that's why face-to-face engagement is so important, because face-to-face engagement is how you build trust. Look at the testimony of Dr. Fauci. I don't know how many of you watched it here recently. I mean, they do it over and over again. What are they trying to do? They're trying to break his credibility, right? Rand Paul and the others are trying to show that he's not a trustworthy person, not just that what he's saying is wrong, but that he's a liar, okay? That is a toxic message. And that's why this is not misinformation, it's disinformation. It is intentionally created by people who have something to gain. Think about the tobacco companies trying to convince you that smoking didn't cause lung cancer, or the fossil fuel companies trying to convince you that climate change is a hoax. They have something to gain by creating disinformation, convincing you that a falsehood is true, and getting you to distrust the people who are telling the truth. Now, to me, what that shows is that's a very depressing finding, but it shows why all of the cases I was reading happened in the way that they did. It's because the people who had their beliefs converted were people who enlarged their identity group and began to trust other people who were telling them accurate information. I'll give you two quick stories. First, in 2014, there was a measles outbreak in Vancouver, Washington, which is just across from Portland, Oregon, across the Columbia River, my hometown. And there was a strong anti-vax community in Vancouver, as in Portland. So, of course, they had a measles outbreak. Governor Jay Inslee of Washington State, who's no science denier, remember he ran for president on a climate change platform, he sent public health officials down to talk to the anti-vaxxers one-on-one, and it worked. Now, they didn't get all of them, but they got quite a number of them to agree to take their shots. You can read about this in a story in the Washington Post. If you put in Google, though not right now, please, it will take off like wildfire, Washington Post. The story will come up. And there's a quotation from one woman who said, that scientist who I spoke with, he was so warm. He was so nice. He explained cell interaction on a whiteboard for 2 hours, and I changed my mind. Now, some of you are horrified when I say that because you think 2 hours, really, one-on-one? That's what it takes. But for me, that's very good news, right? That means that once a science denier can begin to trust another person, they change their mind. I'll give you my favorite example next. Jim Bridenstine was a member of the US House of Representatives, rock-ribbed Republican conservative who gave a speech on the floor of the House some years back, saying that climate change was a hoax, right? Saying all the things that climate deniers say. So of course, Donald Trump appointed him to be head of NASA, because what else would you do with a guy who was a climate denier, but put him in charge of maybe the preeminent agency that was gathering climate data, right? So, he was going to bollocks up NASA. But an interesting thing happened. A couple of months into Jim Bridenstine's tenure at NASA, he changed his mind. And he came out and made another speech and publicly said, I was wrong. Climate change is real and we're causing it and we need to do something about it. Now, how did that happen? Bridenstine said he read a lot. Okay, maybe that's true. But I think what happened is this. All of a sudden, he was working at NASA. And remember the part about how you're supposed to distrust scientists? Well, maybe he didn't know any scientists before, but now he did. Now he was their boss. Now he was hanging out with them in the halls and having meetings and lunch with them. And all of a sudden, he began to trust them. And so the facts, not from the evil scientists that you're supposed to distrust, but from Bill and Steve and Tanya down the hall, began to make sense. And he changed his mind. That's what I think happened in any case. Even empirical beliefs can be tribal. Even empirical beliefs can be influenced by your social group, by what you want to believe, but also by what the people around you believe. There's probably a very good evolutionary reason why we would tend to want to believe what the people around us would believe. But now this presents a bit of a problem, as I said, because Jonathan Swift said, you can't reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. So, how are you going to do this, right? But we've now got empirical data to show that you sort of can reason somebody out of something they didn't reason themselves into in the first place, as long as you don't start with reason. Start with trust and warmth and patience and respect, and be calm and don't insult them and don't tell them they're stupid, because that does not work, okay? But once they begin to trust you, face to face, I think is important, then the evidence can be more persuasive. They will begin to listen to you. And listening to you is the only way that they're ever going to change their mind. Some other tidbits that I picked up along the way. Nyan and Riefler did some more research on this problem and found that graphs help. Graphs help especially with conservatives. And I think the research was around climate change. So, pictures worth 1,000 words, a graph's probably worth 10,000, right? And emphasize graphs more than words in some cases. There's some interesting stuff in the literature on this. But the overall point is, as I said, to listen, to be patient, and to show respect. You can change somebody's mind if you engage. And here I want to talk about one of my personal experiences. So before the Bates and Schmid study came out, I bought a ticket and I flew to Denver, Colorado in the fall of 2018, and I went to the Flat Earth International Conference. There were 650 flat earthers there, and me, and a handful of people in the media. And the first day I kept my mouth shut. I, bought the badge and I sat in on the meetings, and I just wanted to hear what they had to say, because they claimed that their beliefs were based on evidence. A number of them were evangelical Christians, but they claimed that their beliefs were not based on faith, that it was based on evidence. And some of their seminars were billed as the evidential seminars. In some cases, they were things that they presented evidence in favor of flat Earth, they said. In others, evidence against the round Earth, which were mostly conspiracy theories that they had. So evidence, interpreted loosely here, okay? Now, this gave me a great opening, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physicist. I wasn't going to be able to go in there and start talking to them about the Coriolis effect, right? I wasn't going to be able to start talking to them about, the position of the Earth and Sun, the shadows, eclipses, any of that. Okay, I took a little bit of physics, but they had read quite a bit of physics. You think you're going to go in and talk to a flat earther, and you're going to know some fact that they haven't already seen and got a talking point about? You're wrong. They have done their reading. But I didn't want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about how they were reasoning, because I'm a philosopher. And my idea going in, you can see why I was so excited by the Bates and Schmid study, right? Confirmation bias, because they proved the thing that I was already using, right? The thing that I was using at this point was technique rebuttal, but it hadn't been named such. I was out there trying to ask the flat earthers, not what they believed, but, well, why do you believe that? And so when I, in the second day, started to open my mouth and let them know who I was, I began to talk to them about why they believe what they believe. The question that I had the most success with was, you say that your view is based on evidence. That's right. Okay, so that sounds very scientific. So tell me this: what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, would convince you that you were wrong? Now, if they could not answer that, that was trouble. Now, some of them would immediately say proof. That's trope number 5, insistence that science has to be perfect. Science can't offer proof. Science can offer very, very, very high probability given the evidence. But it's not about certainty and proof. It's not Euclidean geometry or deductive logic. At which point some of them were surprised, and I'd say, well, no, it's not about proof. That can't, we're talking about likelihood given the evidence. But then they were talking on my terms. I had hijacked the discussion to talk about how they were reasoning. In some cases, they would offer a conspiracy theory. And I would say, but why do you believe that? How do you know that that person isn't lying to you? Some photographic evidence they believed, some they didn't. How do you know which picture is faked, et cetera, okay? So my hypothesis going into this was based on the earlier reading. The 5 tropes were already around. I knew that all science to now was reasoning was the same. I knew about the 5 tropes, and so I was pushing back on this. And I also thought that if I learned how to talk to a flat earther who maybe is not hurting anybody, but they're kind of the worst of the worst science deniers, if you think about it, if I could learn how to talk to them, I could talk to climate deniers, I could talk to anti-vaxxers, because they're all reasoning in the same way. So my goal was to get the flat earthers to listen. And they did. They were fascinated with what I had to say, because lay people, unbelievers, tended not to show up, okay? And so they wanted to convert me, in fact. This was kind of an interesting moment. Because what I would do is I would push back. I would listen to the guest speakers, and I would grab them when they came off stage, and we would have a little mini discussion where a crowd would gather. And, we would talk about this. One guy, my best discussion, I grabbed him when he came off stage. This was a guy who was very sharp. He was a very skilled debater. His seminar was on how to convert people into flat Earth. He went out there with the sign on the corner, "The Earth is flat, ask me how," and would talk to people and convert them face to face. And I thought, I got to talk to this guy, because in some ways he's kind of doing what I'm trying to do, right? And guess what? He said in the seminar: calm, patience, respect. He was using the same techniques to get him into it that I was trying to use to get him out of it. So I had to take this guy to dinner, and he took me up on it. And I said, "If I buy you dinner, yeah, absolutely. No recording, no transcription, nobody else was there, just the 2 of us. But we talked about flat Earth the whole time." Now, I didn't know but that he was going to run away, right? So I wanted to start with my toughest question. And, we hadn't even had our entrees yet. And I said, okay, so your view is based on evidence, right? Yes. So what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, would convince you that you were wrong? And he said, well, I guess I'd have to go up in a rocket ship. And I'm thinking, how am I going to get this guy up in a rocket ship? But this was before Elon Musk and all the rest, right? But he said, but then he immediately said, well, no, maybe the glass is going to be curved. So, even if I saw it from a rocket ship. I said, okay. I said, well, now I just got out of another seminar before yours in which they said that Antarctica is not a continent. He said, that's right. Now, flat earthers believe that Antarctica doesn't exist as a continent because the Earth is not round, that Antarctica is a mountain range spread out around the perimeter of the Earth, which means that it's 24,000 miles long, as opposed to the 1,500 that I think it is. So I said to him, why don't we fly over Antarctica? And he said, those flights don't exist. That's what they said in the seminar. And I said, here in my back pocket. And I pulled out the flight itinerary for a flight from Santiago, Chile to Auckland, New Zealand, and said, let's go. He said, have you been on that flight? And I said, no, neither have you. Let's go. And he shook my hand. And I thought, brilliant. Now I'm going to go to all my friends in the humanist community, and you're each going to give $10, and we're going to buy the tickets, and we're going to film it. This is going to be awesome, right? But we both started to worry because they have windows on those planes, and maybe he was going to say that the windows were curved, right? And so I said to him, look, we're both taking a risk doing this. We got to come up in advance with a criteria to judge who's right. How about we have a criteria like that we have to stop, if we have to stop to refuel, because we can measure that, right? Because if you're right, Antarctica is 24,000 miles long, and we'd have to stop to refuel. But if I'm right, it's much smaller than that, and we can make it on one tank of gas. So we can measure that. Even with the windows closed, we can measure that, right? Absolutely. We shook hands. And I thought, double awesome. I'm going to, we're going to go. This is really going to happen. 30 seconds later, he took it back. And here's what he said. He said he couldn't go. And I said, why not? And he said that maybe no plane had to stop to refuel. And I said, could you elaborate? And he said, maybe it's a hoax. Maybe no plane ever has to stop, and it's just all a hoax. Gigantic conspiracy theory, right? And I said, wait a minute. So what you're telling me is that the entire history of aviation, since before you and I were born, is made up against tonight when I'm sitting here trying to convince you to fly over Antarctica to prove to you that the Earth is round. And he said, that's right. Now, at that point, drop the mic, I could leave. But I didn't want to leave. We hadn't even eaten yet, right? I mean, and I wanted to continue to talk to him. I mean, that would have been rude, patience, respect, calm, right? That would have been a rude thing. And I was trying to get him to realize that what he had just admitted was terrible, right? Because he had said that his views were based on the evidence, but anything that he had said, anything we'd come up with as a way to change his beliefs based on the evidence, he wouldn't admit to. Now, if I'd been mean, I could have said to him, oh, so I guess your view is based on faith then, because any scientist could tell you what evidence would change their mind, but you can't do it. But I didn't do that. We talked for the next 2 hours. I didn't convince him. He didn't convince me. But the interesting part for me was that we had a cordial conversation. We parted as friends. And I think that we built up some trust through our engagement. He was asking my advice on certain things, on how they were messaging things. I could feel some respect, some mutual respect between the two of us. I didn't respect his beliefs. He didn't respect mine. But we had some moments as human beings. It's an amazing thing when you talk to somebody you disagree with face to face. You begin to build a bond with them. Now, I made a big mistake. I didn't get his contact information. I didn't follow up. So of course I didn't convince him, because after, any trust I'd built up, that I never saw him again. And I'll say this, I didn't convince any of the flat earthers. I mean, nobody that I know of, nobody tore off their lanyard and said, what a fool I was. But is that the measurement? I mean, it would have been great, and I would have written about it in the book if it had happened. But what did happen on many occasions is that I got them to listen to me. And I thought that that in and of itself was a breakthrough, just to be able to talk to somebody who was a science denier. Because remember those cases of the people like Jim Bridenstine, if you can have more than one conversation, actually get them to trust you over time, they will perhaps change their mind. Most won't, but if they're going to, that's the way that it's going to happen. And I want to close with the following idea. I hear all the time from people who say, I could never do what you did. I couldn't get out there. And besides, what difference would it make? It's not worth talking to these people. That's science denial. Bates and Schmidt have shown that it's worth talking to these people. Bates and Schmidt have shown that it's worthwhile and that you're not causing harm and that their technique rebuttal and content rebuttal work. So that's not a good excuse for not doing it. I'm trying to build an army of people who talk to science deniers. It is frustrating, right? Imagine how many people we would need to do this. But I think that there are more allies of science than science deniers in the world. And if we each did a small part, we could do this. I think that it is worth arguing this with these people, because my reading of the history of science denial is that if we just go home and be right, the problem metastasizes. Disinformation gets fed over and over again on the internet. They go to conventions and they become radicalized. And then we have a situation like we have today, where COVID denial was born before our very eyes. Look at how fast COVID denial started. When I started writing my book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, COVID was not a thing. And then I got the contract for the book, and then the COVID lockdown started. And I said to my editor, I'm going to need a chapter at the end for COVID denial. And he said, what do you mean? There is no COVID denial. And I said, just wait, because you could see that this was going to happen with the anti-vax, movement was going to take hold of this, which it did, and then it became politicized, and we all know the rest of that story. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and just take whatever questions you have, and just hope that you will consider, read my book on how to talk to a science denier. But I've also got some free things out there. I've got an article in Nature called Talking to Science Skeptics is Not Hopeless. And I've got one in American Journal of Physics called Calling All Physicists, where I was trying to get some physicists to come with me to the next Flat Earth Convention, which of course COVID kept us from doing. But I have convinced a very good physicist to come with me. He built a Flat Earth model on this computer, which shows empirically that they're wrong. And we're going to go rent a booth and do that next when COVID allows next. So
thank you so much.
Thank you. And what are your questions for me?
That was really great. Again, I've seen you talk on this and other topics before, and you're so clear and your thoughts are so persuasive. I really like that you,
Thank you.
take a shot at the backfire effect, which is many of us in the skeptical movement have heard of that previously.
Yeah.
And it's good to know that it isn't real.
Yeah, several studies have debunked it, but everybody thought it was true not that many years ago.
Right. All right. So I remind folks that you can type your questions into the chat if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. I really, because we have so many people tonight, I encourage you to ask a question rather than just making a comment. Questions do end with a question mark, not an exclamation point. And also, as Howard suggested, you can raise your hand. There's a capability within the Zoom interface to raise your hand. And if you have problems with either of those, go ahead and unmute and speak up. I've got a couple of my own questions. And how about
Or you could type it into the chat window, and we could
Yeah,
relay it for
I
you.
just saw one in the chat. Somebody asked me to repeat the 5 tropes.
Good.
And I'll also tell you that you can find them online. Somebody has come up with the acronym FLICC, F-L-I-C-C. If you put in F-L-I-C-C, John Cook has come up with them, a description. They're cherry picking evidence, belief in conspiracy theories, engaging in illogical reasoning, reliance on fake experts, and believing that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. But look up FLICC, and John is terrific because he's made it so those are the 5 roots, and then he goes into all the branches of the the different take it off from there. Really brilliant work.
Great. We have another question online. How do you attempt pre-bunking? Or maybe our speaker meant debunking or a question, but how do you
they're both, right?
Okay.
So debunking is when the person hears the misinformation and you try to talk them out of it. Pre-bunking is when you say in advance of them hearing the misinformation, you're like my friend Andy says, you're trying to inoculate them before. So imagine a situation in which you said to somebody, now you're going to hear a speaker, and the speaker is going to try to tell you that there is, a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles who are controlling the government. Okay, that's called a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories are bad for the following reason, right? And then when they hear somebody from QAnon, they're less likely to believe it because they've been inoculated against it. Now the question is, does pre-bunking work better than debunking, which is when they hear about QAnon and then you say, well, don't you know that that's a conspiracy theory? And here's what's wrong with it. There must be studies out there which measure pre-bunking versus debunking. Which one is better? I don't know if there's specific studies on that for science, and I think my friend Andy would know. I should ask him that. But from my point of view, they both work. I mean, they're both solid techniques. Bache and Schmid use debunking, but Sander van der Linden, who is a commentator on their study, is really an expert on pre-bunking, and he made the argument that you should give equal time to pre-bunking because it not only works, but it may work better than debunking. And again, remember that idea, the first thing you hear is the thing you're going to believe. So get to them before they hear the misinformation. Inoculate them against that misinformation. Boost their mental immunity.
So the question went on and say, how do you do pre-bunking when they watch Fox News, or I might broaden that and say conservative media. Fox News or conservative media is often a constant companion for many science deniers.
So it is hard because we are in the midst of what some have called an infodemic, right? Where we not only have a pandemic, we don't have a disease, but we have the information pollution. We have the information stream, which is polluted by partisan and false content, sometimes intentional, sometimes not, on the internet, on partisan cable TV, and that makes it harder. This is when I was talking about the hardened people, the people who are been marinating in the disinformation. But is it possible for them to be converted? Yes. Look at Jim Bridenstine. How much more hardened could you be than somebody who goes on the floor of the US House and gives a speech saying that climate change is a hoax, and then he takes it all back a couple months later? I mean, that's a pretty epic turnaround, if you ask me. So hardened people, look, it's harder to get them. Science denial is a spectrum. Some people it's easiest to see this with anti-vax. Some people just have questions because, they've heard that vaccines are dangerous. And then they begin to Google, and then they think, oh no, look at all this. They watch one YouTube video, you're going to get 20 of them. And they're all, because of the way YouTube is set up, they're all going to be anti-vax videos. And then they start to talk to their friends about it. And then their friends reinforce it. They're slipping further and further along that spectrum. By the time they go to an anti-vax convention, it's almost too late. The conventions are used to radicalize people. So get to them as early as you possibly can.
So your technique reminds me a lot, and we have another viewer on tonight's program who is also reminded of the practice of street epistemology.
Yes. Yes.
The listening carefully, the probing questions. Can you think of any piece of evidence that would convince you or convince you that maybe you're wrong, etc. And that leads me to think that the humanist community might be a good set of allies for what you are trying to accomplish, because compassion for people, trying to be deliberately respectful of others should be a part of, belief in science should be a part of the way that we comport ourselves.
I agree. I mean, I had never heard of street epistemology when I wrote this book. And then as a result of the book, I was contacted by Anthony, I'm going to mispronounce his last name, Magnabasco, I think it is, who is, out there advocating for this based on some earlier work by Peter Boghossian and I never remember the other fellow's name. Now, I did cite their book, How to Have Impossible Conversations or How to Have Difficult Conversations. I forget what it was. And, we're philosophers, so we're both borrowing from Popper, right? Karl Popper was the one who came up with the question, what evidence could convince you that you were wrong? So it's kind of drawing on the same pool. There are some similarities with street epistemology, absolutely. And in fact, that's kind of a cheering result, I think, because once I started to get out on the road and started, from my house on Zoom, talk about this for this book, I started to hear of other people who were using similar techniques: active listening, motivational interviewing. Look at Daryl Davis's work, talking people out of the Ku Klux Klan. Right? Look at Steve Hassan, deprogramming people from cults. This is how they do it. It's the same method.
Adam Grant in his book Think Again talks a lot about these methods, as does Amanda Ripley in her book High Conflict.
Yeah. Now, Adam Grant is wonderful. Absolutely. So, I mean, I'm not claiming to have invented this. This was around. My contribution was to wonder, could this work on science denier? I mean, before I knew what it was called, what I read was an article by Michael Shermer in Scientific American back when, where he said, if you're going to talk to a science denier, don't insult them, be respectful, be kind. And I thought, wow, that sounds kind of interesting. Would that work better face to face? And I went out and tried it again before Bates and Schmidt, right? So that's where I learned it. But it's kind of like all these other little, lights go down low and all these other little campfires on the beach. Yeah, all these other people are doing the same thing and it's working. So it's kind of incredible.
Another question from the chat. How do you as a layperson, or how does one, I know that you are not a layperson. Well,
I am about a lot of things.
Yeah, depends on what laity means in this context. But how does a layperson address those who listen to other experts who know just enough to be dangerous? They have enough of the science right to make their arguments sound legitimate, but they fall short on the facts. How do you deal with that?
So this comes up. So remember trope 3, reliance on fake experts. In some cases, they're real experts. That is, at least they have a degree. Some cases they're MDs or PhDs. And what can you say if you're not an expert to discredit them? But there are things that come up. So I'll point out here that recently the Center for Countering Digital Hate did a study in which they found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was spread by 12 people. 12 people. some of whom were MDs. So presumably they're real experts in this. So why shouldn't you believe them? Well, one thing you can do as a layperson is follow the money, probe a little, ask yourself, what else does this person believe? Is this person selling an alternative cure? Does this person make their money by spreading disinformation? And I think that if you look at what are now called the disinformation dozen, you'll find that in quite a number of cases with anti-vax, I don't care if they're MDs or PhDs, they are, they've got some questionable practices. They're making millions of dollars in some cases by selling false alternative cures. So it leads you to wonder, are they denigrating vaccines because that'll cause people to buy their cures? This came up in the vax debate earlier with years ago with Andrew Wakefield, who was a real genuine MD researcher, had published this paper arguing that the MMR vaccine caused autism. Well, due to some peer review, they found out, later after the study had come out, it wasn't peer reviewed before it came out, they found out, I don't think, they found out that there were real problems with this study. It was sloppily done. There were some real limitations, and the study was retracted. And then an investigative journalist went to work, interviewed all the folks in the study, and found out that it was fraud. So it was not just sloppy, it was fraud. And then it came out that Wakefield had a competing interest in an alternative vaccine. Aha, right? So that's what a person can do. The investigative journalist was not an MD, but he exposed Wakefield. I won't say he's a fake expert because he's an MD, but he showed that his work was fraudulent.
Yeah, that question, by the way, came from the new executive director of the American Humanist Society. Nadia Dutchin has joined us here tonight. So Nadia.
Thank you for the question.
And next we have another question. If you try technique rebuttal by telling someone what they believe is a conspiracy theory, why would they believe you that it's a conspiracy theory?
Yeah. I don't know how to answer that one. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they are hermetically sealed. A conspiracy theorist will cherry pick any possible evidence that fulfills their view, right? There'll be some pattern in the data that you didn't see and they say, no, don't you see that actually supports the conspiracy? So they will bend or cherry pick whatever fact they need to try to show that there's evidence in favor of their conspiracy theory. But if there's no evidence for the conspiracy theory, or even if there's counter evidence to their conspiracy theory, they'll say, that just shows you how good the conspirators are. That's what they want you to think, right? They won't let you have the real data. So how do you get through to them? I don't know. I consider conspiracy theories to be one of the most toxic forms of human reasoning. It goes way back. I mean, the first recorded conspiracy theory was about Nero burning Rome. He didn't, to all accounts, actually burn Rome, but when he got back, he was so pissed at people claiming that he had burned Rome that he invented the second conspiracy theory, which is that the Christians had done it. And this was when they started he thought it was justifiable to start burning the Christians, right? So conspiracy theories go way back. And there's a certain, I don't know, it's a certain fascination with them because it makes you feel like you're on the inside, you're in the matrix, something that nobody else knows. There's a real attraction. The flat earthers would unapologetically say that they believed in conspiracy theories. They would say, well, what are your top 10 conspiracy theories? I mean, I heard people talking about chemtrails, lizard people. We never went to the moon, all of these things that they believed.
Right, one of our viewers messaged me and said that the idea of the number of people that must be in on a conspiracy can help provide a reasonable doubt, at least, from the president down to the janitor, at NASA who
Could
would be
you
in on
imagine?
taking the right.
So the flat earthers, I mean, that was one thing I used in them. Could you imagine a conspiracy where every single world leader was in on it? I mean, they thought that Trump was in on it. Could you imagine him keeping his mouth shut about something like that? No.
Right.
You could never get every airline pilot, every teacher, every scientist, every world leader to keep a secret like that.
We have another question. Vaccines are an interesting root motivator. Have you noticed that the early vaccine deniers who come mostly from the political left are different than the current vaccine deniers who tend to be mostly conservative?
Anti-vax was about 50-50 liberal and conservative before COVID. And a lot of the anti-vaxxers in Vancouver during that measles outbreak were from the left. That one had not really been politicized. People can be anti-vaxxers for different reasons. In some cases, they don't trust big pharma. Some cases, they don't trust big government. Some cases, it's libertarianism. You know, I mean, people can come from different perspectives, right? But certain areas of science denial have been politicized. Some of them are about money. Some of them are about ideology, some about politics. But what happened with COVID is it was politicized. Not the first time. Climate change was politicized. COVID ended up being politicized. Didn't have to be that way. I mean, I can imagine a world in which Trump had said, look, you know, this COVID is going to tank the economy. All good Americans should get out there and get their vaccines. After all, I'm the one who helped invent them. So get out there and get your vaccines. You know, it could have been politicized the other way. You know, I could imagine that. That not every piece of science denial is politicized, though. I have to say, I couldn't figure out. To my knowledge, flat Earth was not politicized, and it wasn't economically motivated either. I couldn't figure out if it didn't seem to be really based on disinformation. That one I think maybe is misinformation. I couldn't figure out who would be feeding lies about that out there. It just didn't make sense to me. Maybe I missed it.
One of the other techniques that I've seen with science deniers, the same kind of thing happens with people who argue for supernaturalism, whether it's belief in a god or ghosts or whatever. One technique that I've seen is the Gish Gallop. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
And the other is constantly moving the goalpost. You know, it's a whack-a-mole. You try to get rid of one point and they bring up another one, and it's just a barrage. That's
why you have to ask what would convince you.
You let them do that,
because otherwise you let them say, here's the criteria, and then you try to meet that criteria, because otherwise it is whack-a-mole. With the flat earthers, I found this, you know, you'd say one thing and they go, well, yeah, that's a good point, but what about this? What about this? What about this? And you'd never come to the end of it.
Right.
They tend not to live or die by definitive experiments. By the way, I had an earlier book called The Scientific Attitude, in which I argue that what's most distinctive about science is that scientists put it all on the line for evidence. Scientists care about evidence and they're willing to change their mind based on new evidence. That is an incredible thing that exists. I mean, we live in a world in which people are willing to change their mind on the basis of empirical evidence, and our lives are better for it. I mean, I just find that something to celebrate, that it's remarkable that it exists to the extent that it does, because there are so many forces that lead us to believe what we want to believe and to, you know, change the goalposts and, you know, change the criteria. So, you know, I see science denial as the opposite. This is no surprise of what scientists do, because scientists do change their mind on the basis of evidence. They can tell you in advance precisely what would change their mind. And if you show it to them, they will change their mind. Deniers do not do that. In fact, that's one way to know that you're talking to a denier. Some people will say, how dare you say that people who question the scientific consensus are a denier. And I say, I didn't say that. If you question the scientific consensus and you have no evidence for your view, and you won't say what evidence would convince you, then you're a denier.
Mhm. Yeah, that certainly makes some sense. But you try to tell someone that they don't have evidence or that they have a very poor argument, and that can lead to the whack-a-mole again.
It can. Believe me, it was frustrating. I wanted to debunk them so bad. I mean, you cannot be there and not feel that. But it cannot be done. It cannot be done in the sense that they're going to say, oh my God, you're right. I was so foolish. That you're never going to get that moment. You're not going to get that Perry Mason moment.
So one of the things you mentioned just a moment ago was the wonderful fact that we live in an era where science and a deference to facts is granted a certain cachet. And what I wonder is that necessarily true, or is that just a cultural convention that we've been exposed to in the past during the scientific revolution and subsequently?
Well,
and are we in danger of losing that deference to expertise and facts in a post-fact world?
Yes. I mean, it is something of a miracle that science exists at all. I mean, the Dark Ages, you can imagine these times when people didn't do this. I mean, look at modern medicine. Until very, very, very recently, medicine was not a science. I mean, imagine somebody like Semmelweis saying, we really ought to wash our hands before we, perform these surgeries, and having the evidence to show it, and having people say, are you suggesting that a gentleman's hands are unclean? If the little beasties, the little germs exist, where are they? I mean, okay, so these are examples of people who wouldn't change their mind on the basis of evidence. Were they scientists? I don't think so. The people were pushing back because Semmelweis had the evidence to show that he was right. So, I mean, so you do sometimes in science get the gadfly who is correct, and the whole profession was wrong. It happened in geology with, Wegener and Harlan Bretz. It happened with Semmelweis. It happened with Galileo. And sometimes science deniers see themselves as that gadfly. They're going to be the Galileo. They're going to be the one that the whole profession laughed at, but they're going to show it. And I say to them, yeah, but Galileo had the evidence, didn't he? Where's your evidence? It's not enough to say that your view might be true. Right. You have to have something to offer to get people to change their mind. And if you don't have that, you cannot complain that you should be able to kick down the door of science and have everything grind to a halt while they, consider what you consider to be evidence for telekinesis.
Right.
Present your facts or get out.
So one of our viewers, actually Mike, the other fellow who talks to our community about science quite often, says that Richard Dawkins seems to have spent a lot of his time dealing with science deniers instead of pursuing his own science. And that makes me think about people, the debate between Bill Nye and Kim Ham that was is available on YouTube. You have two perspectives on that. You've got the people who said that Bill Nye was wasting his time and providing a platform for Ken Ham to stand up in front of thousands and spout his nonsense. And then you have the other side that says we must engage with these people and provide counterpoints. What's your thought about scientists or science communicators who actively try to engage in these conversations?
It's a great question. I mean, you do not want to ever give a platform for liars. You don't want to give the liar the microphone, because even if you give equal time to the truth, there will be a percentage of the audience who will become infected with the bad information just from hearing the lies from the person with the microphone. So, the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate is a good example, because we have to ask, did that do more harm than good? I mean, I love to watch it, but it wasn't intended for me. It's not going to convince me. I was already convinced. But if you're giving a platform for somebody to spread misinformation, I think it's a bad thing. Now, what I did in going to the convention, I was not providing any platform. Nobody was filming me. I was there all by myself, talking to them one-on-one. It might be a different question if they wanted me to debate. I'm not sure I would agree to that. You don't want to give oxygen to a lie.
Interesting. We've seen Michael Shermer debate Deepak Chopra, for example. They've done that a few times. And I have the same genuine question. I literally don't have my own definitive opinion about whether that kind of engagement is valuable.
He's almost a special case, Michael, because he's so good at it that he can kind of debunk them, right in front of their face. Now some viewers are not going to see it that way. They're going to think, oh, he tried and missed. I don't know. I mean, can I wimp out here and say it depends on how good you are at it? But again, this is an empirical finding in Bates and Schmidt, and they say, do not attend the debate if it will result in misinformation being spread. And if it's a publicized debate, in most cases, it's going to be an opportunity. Look, you see this in the media all the time. Remember how it used to be with anti-vax and with climate change before the media stopped having those awful split screen debates? You'd have some scientist from the National Academy of Science and then some guy with a website, and they'd give him split screen, equal time.
False equivalency,
yeah. And they just let him go at it. And then the commentator, who of course has to remain objective, would say, well, it's a tough issue, you decide. I mean, it's literally, in some cases, they would say to the audience, you decide. I've said before, the halfway point between the truth and a lie is still a lie.
Right.
The media is supposed to take the side of truth and not give the liars a microphone. There are some media outlets that will no longer book climate deniers. Huffington Post won't do it. The BBC will not do it. So, I think that we need to deplatform liars.
Yeah, it's hard to do in a country where free speech is a fundamental.
Well,
principle.
it's not violating free speech. Look, free speech protects us from government censorship. Private companies can do what they want. We don't have to participate in debates. But I mean, the people who complain about free speech, imagine somebody said, look, we have to allow political extremists, the worst sort of political extremists, to get a permit and have their parade because we have to protect free speech. That's a very different claim than to say, and we have to give them a microphone and help them pass out their leaflets.
Right.
You never do that. You'd never do that, right? And so in some cases, putting them on CNN for these debates is helping them spread their leaflets, right? It's the 21st century equivalent of that. So, I mean, private companies do not have to do that. And by and large, the media outlets have stopped doing those awful split screen debates.
On the other hand, you'll
still see it with COVID though, don't you now? Sometimes even on MSNBC and CNN, they'll make it sound like it's a debate.
Well, we see that with folks that are grilling Dr. Fauci repeatedly. Yes. It's another version of both sides of the issue, except that the talking heads are elected members of our government, and that's
and they film it and they televise it, and then people. There's a George Lakoff is a brilliant psychologist who came up with the idea of the truth sandwich. If you repeat the lie, even to debunk it, you're repeating the lie. You're giving the lie oxygen. So if you're going to tell somebody the lie, put truth on either side of it. Here's the truth. Here's what the liar says, which is false. Again, here's the truth. Make a truth sandwich. You can't do, the way the media often does it is they'll say the false claim and then they'll do a half-assed job of debunking it. And what people remember is the false claim.
Yeah. Let me get back to a couple of questions from our audience. How do you counter all the very strange anti-vaccination stories? We had one person claim they were magnetized because of their shot, and nothing would change the person's mind, even when a spoon didn't stick to their
with
skin.
a magnet.
Yeah, that made the
okay.
person magnetized. They just have these bizarre things, and they won't even consider evidence.
Some people cannot be convinced. Now, look, one of the most virulent lies about the COVID vaccine was the idea that they would have microchips in them. How many times did you hear that story?
Right.
And, you hear that story enough and you think, where did that come from? I chased that one down. That one appeared in a publication called the Oriental Review in April 2020. Lockdown was in March 2020. This story appeared in the Oriental Review in April 2020, which is, by the way, before the vaccines were even invented, right? But it said that any future vaccines developed in the West would have microchips in them, courtesy of Bill Gates, who had put out a patent on this technology.
It came out that early. Wow.
Do you know who is behind that story? Russian intelligence. The Oriental Review is a propaganda arm of the FSB in Russia. So that story came out of a Russian troll farm, was fed through through an English language journal. By May 2020, 44% of Republican voters believed that any future vaccines would have microchips.
Wow.
Dangerously effective propaganda techniques. Now, I'm not saying that all of the disinformation comes out of Russia, but Russia has a history. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is an actual conspiracy. That's what they all say. But I have the receipts for this. There is an article in the New York Times called Putin's Long War Against American Science, which gives the evidence that Putin has been subsidizing and running and favoring these troll farms for anti-vax propaganda even before COVID. Why would he want to do that, by the way? Because they've got a competing vaccine. It's called Sputnik. I mean, they're not being subtle about it. They want the Sputnik vaccine to be the one that's available over the earth. So how do they do that? By denigrating the Pfizer and Moderna. Here's the coda to that story. They did such a good job of undermining people's faith in vaccines that people aren't even taking the Sputnik vaccine in Russia now. They've got some anti-vaxxers in Russia. So once you create that Frankenstein's monster of disinformation, it is very hard to control it. There is a shocking amount of science denial propaganda in the West that is created by foreign intelligence services. And they do it because their goal is to polarize us and to keep us from having trust in American institutions, one of which is science.
So,
There's a lot of, the Wall Street Journal did a series on this, the New York Times had that article. There's a lot of literature on this, which nobody saw, nobody paid any attention to. About March, April of 2021, there was some stories on this, but chase this back. That's where some of it comes from.
Yeah, that would make an interesting book in of itself, is the state-sponsored disinformation campaigns. We had somebody earlier in the chat who asked if any of the 12 biggest anti-vaccine promoters had direct ties or were Russian.
I don't know. That's easy. You can figure that out pretty easily.
I did notice in your prior response that you said that the goal of these people is to, sow division and whatnot.
Yes.
I happen to agree with you, but I also recognize that there's a danger in presuming what somebody else's mindset or goal is, unless you have statements or
true.
evidence to that fact.
That's true. You can see the polarization as a result. That may not be what they intended. Sometimes, I mean, as we just talked about, sometimes there are unintended consequences of this sort of thing. But I think the larger point here is that information warfare is real. And as I said before, science denial is not an accident, it's a lie. Every time a commentator on TV talks about scientific misinformation, I cringe, because for the most part, it's scientific disinformation. It's something that somebody wants you to believe because it serves their economic, political, ideological purpose. People who believe it and spread it, to them, it's misinformation, right? Because they're not doing it intentionally. They actually believe it.
Mm-hmm.
But think about the role of the internet here. How hard is that story in the Oriental Review? At the bottom of it, it said, share on Facebook, share on Twitter, which people did. I mean, it doesn't, and we talked about the Center for Countering Digital Hate and their study with the disinformation dozen. It doesn't take that many disinformers to have a huge, terrible effect. Facebook, they did an internal study at Facebook in which they found that 50% of the anti-vax propaganda on Facebook was due to 111 accounts.
Right.
That's not that many accounts. A tiny number of people are responsible for most of the disinformation.
I love this speculation by one of our viewers. Frank says, is it possible that extreme denial is an instance of costly signaling to prove you are a worthy member of your group? In biology, this idea of the peacock with its grand tail and whatnot.
I believe so. I mean, there is a social aspect to belief. There's a team aspect to belief. This is what people on my team believe. Think about all the folks who are refusing their COVID vaccines. But then I saw some stories not too long ago of them putting on wigs and hats and going over to the next town and getting vaccinated. Why would someone do that? They do that because they don't want their neighbors to know they're getting vaccinated, because it's not what people in their team do. Now, I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that we did the question is based on, I think, the correct idea that some of our beliefs are performative. We don't actually believe it. This is what people on our team believe. Look at how people root for their sports teams. Some of that's performative as well. But I mean, it can be that way even with empirical beliefs. That's the shocking thing.
I think Adam Grant talks about that in his book too.
Dave DeSteno is a psychologist at Northeastern here in Boston. He's done some absolutely brilliant work on this. If anybody is interested, Dave DeSteno, he's found that you can create a community around what color pin you're wearing. Pass out the pins at random, and people will favor the people wearing the pins that match theirs. He did an experiment in which he was measuring whether people would tolerate cheating, and he found that they were more likely to tolerate cheating if somebody was wearing the same color pin, even though they never met that person and the pin didn't stand for anything.
Wow.
They still were more likely to tolerate cheating by a person wearing the same color pin. Tribalism is very strong.
Right. That immediately makes me think of some of the racial tensions that we still face in this country about, identifying in groups and out groups and whatnot. It's just human nature works against us in so many ways. I want to wrap up. We're getting close to 9 o'clock when we typically end. I want to wrap up by asking you a couple of questions. How do we join your army? How do we get trained on your techniques?
Very good.
And then
I've indoctrinated you now. That's good.
And then the last part of it is, how do we find the science deniers to overwhelm with our kindness and probing questions?
Okay, start with the people that already trust you. Going to a convention and trying to build trust is very hard to do. You don't have to do that. Start with the people in your life, your friends and family who already trust you. Then you're already on second base. Try to convince them to get their COVID shots. Try to convince them to believe that climate change is real. go to protests about, climate justice, things like this. I mean, how do you join my army at this point? I mean, I'm an army of one. Anybody can do what I do. Read the Bache and Schmid study. Look, I talk about all this stuff in my book. If you want to read the book, it will tell you some things that you can do. But you can get the Bache and Schmid study free online, and there's some other online resources to do this. Read some inspiring stories. I mean, there are inspiring stories out there of. I read one recently in Business Insider of 4 African-American women in Alabama who converted hundreds of people in their community to get their COVID shots, using more or less the techniques that we're talking about here. There was a study, there was a story in the San Francisco newspaper about one woman who single-handedly convinced something like 1,700 people to get their COVID shots. I mean, just think of the impact, think of the difference that we can make. To my mind, the 2 most dangerous forms of science denial are COVID denial and climate denial. Those are the ones I would work on. I mean, flat Earth is fun to talk about, but it is a sideshow. I don't think they're harmless, because I think that they create a culture of denial. In a world in which flat Earth is tolerated, how much more water can be taken out of the pool? I mean, what's next? Lizard people? I mean, I don't know, right? But science denial has gotten worse over the last 60 or 70 years, and it's because we have not fought back. And we need everybody to fight back against science denial. And I would say climate denial and COVID denial are the most important ones. We've got a shocking number of people in Congress who are still climate deniers. I mean, the climate deniers that we need to convince are, not your Uncle Bob, but the people in Congress. I mean, what good might it do? I don't know who your members of Congress are in Illinois, but are there any of your state representatives or members of Congress or the Senate who are climate deniers? If so, you let them know you're their constituent and you're upset.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it has been just a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to answer our questions and to talk about this topic that you are clearly very passionate about. I do recommend everybody that is able to go to the library or your bookstore or online and look for Lee's book. And Lee, perhaps in a year or 2, we'll have you back. I'm sure you'll have a new book and maybe a new perspective on your Army's progress against science denial.
I hope, thank you. I've enjoyed talking to everybody. I hope, I keep hoping that things get better, and they don't. Maybe it's a backfire effect. Maybe I keep writing these books and things keep getting worse. I don't know, but it's easy to be passionate about this work because there's such a crying need for it. And as somebody who believes in science and reason and rational discussion, it is heartbreaking to see the number of people who are believing incredible, harmful things.
Yeah, I'm with you there. All right, thank you to everybody who tuned in. Keep track of our meetup page where you will see additional programs that we'll be having throughout the month and every month. We are your Prairie State Humanists, member chapter of the American Humanist Association. Thanks again to Nadia for joining us, the executive director of the American Humanist Association. Nadia, do you want to say hello to everyone before we sign off tonight? Or I don't mean to put you on the spot uncomfortably.
It's fine. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate Howard letting me know that this was happening tonight. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you and hopefully getting a chance to meet you, getting back to the Midwest states to check in on the chapters. So when it's safer. But thank you so much for inviting me tonight. It was great.
Thank you.
Just to let everybody know, Nadia has agreed to speak to our chapters to what's going on with the AHA at our April meeting.
All right, and then in February for our traditional Darwin Day program, we will have Aaron Ra the topic is as yet to be fully decided, but Arn is a passionate and incredibly knowledgeable spokesperson and advocate of science and the science of evolution and evolutionary biology and debunking creation myths, among other things. So look forward to that as well. And again, thank you all for tuning in. Keep in touch, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.